Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 in our series on the Evans Gambit, where we're looking at the top mistakes that players are making. In this video, we're looking at the range from 14 to 1800. Let's get to it. Alright, so here's a spreadsheet with the mistakes from the 14 to 1800 range, and the first thing that I want to point out is the column here where I wrote down which side got the opening advantage, white or black. I've highlighted all these ones in blue where it was even, where nobody really got a significant advantage from the opening, and you'll notice that there are quite a few games where that happened. It actually was almost half of the games. It was just pretty even out of the opening. And so I think that's, as you get to the higher rating ranges, that's kind of normal. Players, they understand the openings a little bit better, and so they don't make as many mistakes. So that's to be expected. And when you come down to the bottom, that's why this overall opening success, if we go back to like the lower rated, 72% of the time players got into a really good position. And then from 1000 to 1400, it was 53%. And now here at the higher level, 29.4%. So not as often, but still a decent success rate. And if you add that with the ones that were even, you get a 76%. So slightly more games were successful with white than with black, but really a lot of them turned out to be even. All right, and games that did have mistakes, most of them fell into these top two categories right here. So playing queen b3 at the wrong time or not playing it at the right time, and then black not defending against queen b3 correctly. And that's something that we saw even back on the 1000 to 1400, the queen b3 at the wrong time. So that was, again, a big issue. And these last two aren't really mistakes. They're just different variations that black could play. And I wanted to see how often they happened. And so that's why I wrote these down, because they were some of the more common ones. So I'm going to talk about those real quick, and then we'll come back and jump into these two top mistakes. So first of all, let's look at this bishop d6 line, 8.8%. All right, so from the starting position, after you play b4, black captures and you play c3, chasing the bishop away. Bishop to d6 was played in 8.8% of the game. So that's what this row right here is representing. Now, at first glance, this kind of looks like a weird move because it kind of violates one of the principles. Normally you don't want to block your bishop in, and in this case, the pawn is blocking the bishop. So you need to move the pawn to be able to get the bishop developed. Well, you can't do that because this bishop is blocking it. But it turns out that this e5 square is kind of important, especially after white plays d4. He's going to have a lot of pressure there and maybe playing e5 later. So bishop d6 is actually a pretty decent move for black. So one thing I'll say about the bishop d6 line is that after d4, there's an interesting line you should probably be aware of. I saw this in one of the games. Black played knight f6, and white tried to play bishop g5, pinning the knight. But it's not really great for white because after h6, you either have to give up your bishop and black's queen comes to a pretty active square, or you go back here and black can play g5, and it's just pretty good for black. So g5, bishop g3, and then he can do like even knight takes e4. This is pretty strong for black. So instead of bishop g5, a trickier line that I think is probably better for white is you capture on e5, and it kind of looks natural, like maybe black would capture with the knight. But if he does that, you can take it, and when he recaptures, you've got this f4 move. And this is a good idea to remember if they play bishop d6. Keep an eye out for opportunities when you can play d4, capture, trade off, and then do something like this. So you play f4, and the idea is black's bishop doesn't have anywhere to go except back to d6. But after he does that, you can play e5, and you've got this fork on the pieces here. So now white's just winning. So that's a little trick to be aware of in these bishop d6 lines. It doesn't always work, so you have to, it depends on what black does, obviously, but in that case, just to recap, if you play d4 and they play knight f6, and then you can capture, and they actually have to take with the bishop. If they take with the knight, they fall for that little trick. If they take with the bishop, you can do something similar. You play knight to g5, threatening f7, and after they castle, then you can play f4 with the same kind of threat. Now this is not as good, and actually gets pretty tricky because after like bishop d6, e5, black can go queen e8, which pins the pawn, and then if you castle, they can do like bishop c5 check. So you're not actually winning a piece. It's still a good line for white, but just a couple things to be aware of there. So just to summarize, on the bishop d6 lines, keep an eye out for opportunities after you play d4 to trade on e5 and then eventually move your knight and play f4, and sometimes you can get a fork on those pieces. All right, so the next line that happened in 11.8% of the games, the bishop b6 lines where they decline the gambit. So let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, so at this moment, when you first play the gambit and offer the pawn, they don't have to take it, and sometimes players will just drop the bishop back to b6. And most of these games led to very equal positions. By not taking the gambit, it's not quite as risky for either side. It's more of a slower game, and so something just like c3, let's see, knight f6, and then d3 would be kind of how the game would start, and then just like castles, and you have a pretty normal game here. All right, so we talked about some of these common lines down here, and now the most common mistakes, and actually I forgot to type this in. This should be for white, and this one should be for black. So let's go ahead and start at the top here. Queen b3 at the wrong time, or didn't play it at the right time, something that white did wrong. Okay, so back to the starting position. After they capture, you play c3. One of the most common moves that I saw at this level was actually going bishop to e7. One of the reasons that queen b3 is not always good was because black can just play queen e7 and defend the pawn easily. That's one of the things that I talked about in the previous video. When they play bishop e7, that's not an option. Now, there's still knight h6 to be aware of, but if you play d4, then you take away the knight from going to h6. And so this is one of the common lines that players with the white pieces did not do correctly. So they should have, on bishop e7, they should have played d4, and then after captures, the move is queen to b3. And the point is that black doesn't have a good way to defend this, so they really have to go knight to a5, and then you can capture. After the king goes, you give up the bishop and you take their knight. We talked about this in the previous video. One of the mistakes that I did see in this 14 to 1800 range was queen to d5. So they're trying to keep the queen on that diagonal since it was attacked by the knight to defend the bishop. But if you remember from before, c6, and it's just losing for white because you're not going to be able to continue to defend the bishop. And now black is able to defend his knight. You're just going to lose the piece. So the correct move is, like we said, queen a4, giving up this bishop and taking a knight, and you have good attacking chances. I'm not going to go into this again. We've already talked about it. But that was one of the common issues when going back. When you play b4, c3, and they play bishop e7, you have to be on the lookout for queen to b3. And I think the best way to do that is to just play d4 immediately, and after they capture, you just go for it, queen b3, and then go into the line we just looked at. And then on a similar note, if they don't go to e7 and they go to like c5, and you just kind of play there immediately, it's too early, it's not the right time. Like I said before, queen e7, very easy to just defend the pawn, and it's not good for white. So those are the big mistakes that I saw from white's perspective. All right, so we just talked about this one, and the last one is not defending correctly. This is a mistake that the black side made against queen b3. So let's go look at that. All right, so going back, after capture c3, the mistake that black made, I think in every game, happened after bishop to e7. And so then, if white played d4, captures queen to b3, some players just didn't see this knight a5 move, and they didn't have a good way to defend the pawn and just got into trouble. Like, I think one person played d5, which is just losing a pawn, and then tried to block with bishop e6. But this is really bad for black. You just take it, and yeah, it's not good. I mean, there's things hanging. But they just missed the knight a5 move. And so if you're playing this with black and you are going to play the bishop e7 lines, you have to be aware that if white plays queen b3, knight a5 is really the only option. Another way that this came up was after d4, black played d6, and then again, queen b3 attacking the f7 square. Really the only move for black is knight a5. I think somebody played bishop e6, which is just terrible. I mean, there's you can take it, or you even play d5 and get a fork. It's really bad for black. So that was the other mistake, just not knowing how to handle this queen b3 attack on f7. All right, so if we go back to the spreadsheet and just kind of look back across all these different rating ranges, the one thing that's in common among all of them is this a2 to g8 diagonal, which is this diagonal, if you remember. And then we have queen b3, and then again here, queen b3, and how to, when to play queen b3, when not to play queen b3, how to defend against queen b3. And so biggest takeaway from this series, I think, is this diagonal right here, specifically the move queen to b3. When should you play it? When should you not play it? That seems to be the biggest mistake that a lot of players make. They play it at the wrong time and they don't really understand. So I think I've already kind of talked about it enough in the previous videos, but if I have to say, one thing to take away from the series is make sure to look out for queen b3 and understand when you should play it and when you shouldn't. The other thing I'll say is you can see that at the lower rating, from 600 to 1,000, very good success rate for white playing the Evans Gambit, and that goes down and even the lowest at the highest rating. So, it's definitely still playable even at this rating. I've played it in several games and gotten into fine positions, so this doesn't mean that you can't play it, but if you are in this range from 600 to 1,000, you're going to have the most success with it. All right, guys, well, that's going to wrap up the series on the Evans Gambit. I hope you learned something. It does take a lot of time to, analyze all those games, so hit the thumbs up if you haven't already. I do appreciate that. But let me know in the comments if there's a particular opening that you want to see in the next series. I know I've gotten some people who have given me some suggestions already, but if anybody else has any input, I'd love to hear that, and I'm probably just going to go with either the most interesting suggestion that I get or the most common one. One of those two I'll use to decide which series to do next. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.